Continuing our discussion of tissues, let's now talk about connective tissue. Connective tissue is the second kind of tissue that I talked about before. Remember, we talked about epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue. We will not talk about nervous and muscle tissue this week. On this diagram, this part of the diagram is the connective tissue down here. You have the epithelial tissue up here, the basement membrane, or called basement lamina here, but basement membrane here, and then connective tissue down here. Now, between the cells of the connective tissue, you find this sort of substance that's kind of interspersed throughout. This substance has chemicals, and this substance is called the extracellular matrix. The substance or chemical that's in this extracellular matrix is called ground substance, and it has specific proteins that are part of the extracellular matrix. You also see the collagen fibers are found within connective tissue as well as these cells. Now, the connective tissue is the foundation of the structure for what we put things like the epithelium on, and we'll see in other situations it's the foundation for other tissues. Now, there's different kinds of connective tissue. There's one called loose connective tissue. Loose connective tissue as its name implies, it has a very gel-like ground substance, has fluid and protein, and it looks like it's loosely packed. So it has what appears to be, it's not really air spaces, but it appears to be air spaces. In those spaces, you see these nuclei here, and actually in the previous slide, these cells here, these are called fibroblasts. And these spindle-shaped cells form the connective tissue that they lie in. And once they're surrounded by the matrix that's around them, they change their name from fibroblast to fibrocyte because they quit producing materials. Now, another type, it was actually pictured in the previous slide as well, is called dense irregular connective tissue. And here you have this dense material here. And the difference between loose and dense is as simple as you see here. This is more loose down here, and this is dense here. You see there's far fewer open spaces. In real life, these open spaces have fluid in them, or fat, or other chemicals, whereas the dense areas, where there aren't as many spaces, there's nothing but solid matrix kind of material as well as fibers and etc. And this dense connective tissue is the basis. Here's the epithelium of the skin here. Here's the dead part up here and the keratin. And then you have the basement membrane down here, and then this dense connective tissue underneath it that forms the foundation for the skin. And you can see it's the concentration of collagen, this reddish pinkish material here, that determines whether it's dense or loose. The higher level of collagen leads to a higher or more density. And this area of the skin that's been called dense connective tissue is called the dermis. This is the epidermis of the skin up here. The epidermis stops at the basement layer here, or the basal cells here, and then this is the dermis here. Now this is a picture of what's called dense regular. The previous was irregular. Dense regular connective tissue. And dense regular connective tissue is essentially called regular because it's in lines. It's parallel fibers. And you can see it here. There's this sense of a flow of fibers in a parallel direction. And the fiberglass are lined up alongside each other, and you don't have any sense of anything going in this direction at all. And the dense regular connective tissue is important because it has significant tensile strength. And what tensile strength is the resistance to stretching and tearing when it is pulled. Now you can fold this in half, but you would find it very difficult to tear this. And this is the basis for ligaments and tendons. In this picture over here, a tendon is this dense, regular connective tissue that attaches the muscle to the bone. So this is the tendon. And obviously, if you'd want something that would resist tearing when pulled in this direction. And a ligament attaches bone to bone. So you have that here. The last type of connective tissue is the adipocytes, or the adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat. It's the main component of fat. It's very similar to loose connective tissue. It's important in support, protection, and insulation, but also fat is the most efficient form of nutrient storage. Now, fat looks like this because the actual fat is dissolved away in the fixing process. And in real life, it looks more like this, yellowish in color and filling in the cells. The cells themselves, the adipocytes themselves, contain the fat within them. Once they're cut and fixed, the fat drains away and you have this open spaces here. And these open spaces, you see there's a nuclei there with an open space. And that's an adipocyte. And in real life, it looks like this over here. And adipocytes are what replaces fibrocytes in adipose tissue. And so instead of fibrocytes, you have these adipocytes. And you can see over here in this section of skin, you have the epidermis we talked about, the dermis, and then the fatty layer here. The adipose tissue is below that. Now, cartilage is another form of connective tissue. And cartilage is on the ends of bones, like here and here. And it's very slick and resilient. It's firm and it functions as like hard plastic. Okay, and this is what it looks like under the microscope. You have a cell and a space and a lot of ground substance here in between each of these cells. This is called hyaline cartilage here. There's also elastic cartilage, and elastic cartilage is different than hyaline cartilage in the fact that it has less collagen, and that collagen is replaced by something called elastic fibers that allow it to bend and stretch like a rubber band. Fibrocartilage is cartilage that has toughness to it, and it's supportive, and it is primarily found in the vertebral column between the vertebrae. And then in these spaces are what's known as chondrocytes, which the cells that produce this substance, that maintain this substance, and they are the ones that are the living part of this. The rest of this is just chemical material here. And they sit in little spaces, and those little spaces are called lacunae. And as it produces this material, these cells sort of make their own little cave or own little home here, and that's where they hang out. Now, tissues, when we talk about membranes here, I want to be clear, we're not talking about the same thing we talked about cellular membranes. Okay, the membranes here are combinations of epithelial and connective tissue that go on to make certain types of barriers. And so this slide shows the different kinds of barriers that are produced. There's the cutaneous barrier or cutaneous membrane of skin, mucous membrane, serous membranes, and synovial membranes. And we'll talk about membranes are made up of both epithelial and connective tissue. As I said, the cutaneous membrane is the skin, and it covers the whole body and protects the body from the outside world. The mucous membrane covers the entire GI tract from mouth to anus, the respiratory tract from mouth to the end of the lungs, which is called the alveolus, the urinary tract from kidney all the way into the outside, and the reproductive tract in both males and females. Now, as the book says, the common factor in each of these is the fact that these have to interact with the outside world in some way. And that's these things, the mucous membranes are made up to maximize protection while interacting with the outside world. The second membrane, or the synovial membranes, down here, in this previous diagram that we were looking at, this area right in here is called the synovium, and the synovial membrane lines this synovium, and it also lines this cartilage here. And it's made up of synoviocytes, and it produces a fluid that is inside the joint space called synovial fluid. And this all helps the joint to move and pivot without any discomfort or any slowing down or friction. And it's set up to maximize or minimize the friction that occurs during motion. The third type of membrane that is up here is called the serous membrane. And the serous membrane you probably have never seen unless you've been in the operating room, because it covers the outside of the organs. Organs like the liver, lungs, heart, and so forth. You see this is called the peritoneum. The peritoneum is the covering inside. The pleura is the covering of the lungs. The parietal pleura is the pleura on the chest wall. The visceral pleura is the pleura on the lung itself. When you breathe, the lung has to pass over, and that thin layer that prevents the friction as there's motion with breathing, or motion with the heartbeat, or motion when we move, or the heart's contracting. All of these are covered by these serous membranes, which prevent the friction when these motions occur. Now we're going to end up our lecture today talking about tissue repair. And in order to understand tissue repair, you have to understand a couple of different kinds of tissue. First of all, you have to understand that there are some stromal cells, and then there are parenchymal cells. Stromal cells are the cells that support the parenchymal cells. They help take care of the parenchymal cells, and they form the infrastructure that the parenchymal cells sit on. The parenchymal cells are the cells that actually do the work of the organ. So this is a salivary gland. These are the parenchymal cells, so they produce the saliva, and the stromal cells hold them together and help them get taken care of. And the types of healing that occur depend on whether the parenchymal cells can reproduce themselves, or if the stromal cells are the only cells that can reproduce themselves. So that is a term of regeneration. How well the parenchymal cells can regenerate determines what kind of healing occurs. And it's this ability to recover from injury that determines whether or not something forms a scar or not. So, for example, some healing results when the stromal cells repair. They can repair, but the parenchymal cells cannot repair. And in that case, you end up with a non-functioning scar. Other healing occurs when the parenchymal cells themselves can restore, and the function of the tissue is thus restored. So what this shows is two types of injury to the liver. If you have an acute injury to the liver, the hepatocyte is capable of replicating. And when the hepatocyte replicates, it can form new liver that functions. And so this is healing without a scar. However, during chronic injuries, the liver outstrips its capacity for the parenchymal cells to heal, and the stromal cells will begin to heal with scarring, and that's this blue area here and here. And when this becomes more and more until the scarring is more than the actual parenchyma, and this is what's known as cirrhosis, when you have multiple healing scars within the liver. So this diagram here shows you all the different cells and what cells are responsible for what in terms of being able to cycle and repair. So you have labile cells, which are formed up here, which are shown up here. These are cells that continually undergo mitosis and continually replace and can do so quickly. So this is the epidermis of the skin, for example, and the inside of the GI tract. The second kind of cell is the stable cell, which is shown here. Now this is like the hepatocyte. Now normally the hepatocyte or the stable cell is not undergoing mitosis, but in the site when injury occurs, it can enter the cell cycle and begin to replicate and replace itself. The third type of cell is the permanent cell. And the permanent cell is incapable of undergoing mitosis, so if it's damaged, it's gone. And the only thing that can occur is stromal cells come in and they replace the parenchymal cells in that area and form a scar. So you have continuously turning over cells, the epidermis, the GI tract, blood cells continuously turn over. You have cells that normally don't turn over unless they're stressed, and then you have cells that can't turn over.